Hello, I'm Andy Agathangelo, the founder of the Transparency Task Force. Thank you very much indeed for wanting to watch this video. But just before it starts, here's a short but important message. It really does take a lot of time and money to produce our events, the videos, and all the campaigning work that we do. So if you're not already a subscription member, please do become one. That's really important. You'll find all the details you need through the link that you can see on the screen now. And if for any reason you're unable to become a subscription member, please at least make a donation. You'll see the link for our donations page coming up on the screen now. And just in case you need them, the links to both of those pages are in the video description. Thank you very much. I'm Andy Agathangelo, the founder of the Transparency Task Force. We are a certified social enterprise, which means that we exist to make an impact and not to make a profit. Our overall purpose is to reform the way the financial sector works. We want it to be more transparent, more truthful, more trustworthy. And we go about our work in many different ways. For example, we're the secretariat to an all-party parliamentary group on personal banking and fairer financial services. We respond to consultations about the financial sector. We campaign in the streets of London. We had our first ever rally for better financial regulation in May of this year. We occasionally find ourselves challenging the regulators, and we do all we can, quite frankly, to raise awareness of the importance of the financial sector and the importance that it behaves in an honourable and trustworthy way. One of the most enjoyable things we do is, of course, running our events. And from time to time, our events take us into particularly interesting and relevant books. And having literally just finished reading it on Audible, I can absolutely assure you that Too Big to Jail is a treasure chest, an absolute treasure chest of learnings and insights. I can't quite believe that Chris Blackhurst has done the amount of research he will have had to have done to write the book. I can't quite believe he's had so many conversations with people in high places that was able to share and bring into the book. It really is something we could spend a long time discussing. I hope that sets the scene nicely. Chris, could I please invite you, first of all, just to briefly introduce yourself? I know Brian's going to talk a bit more about your background shortly, but please do briefly introduce yourself, Chris, and tell us what you'd like to share initially about the book, and then we'll organise for yourself and Brian to have this kind of fireside chat with the rest of us folk watching and observing. Thank you, Chris. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Hello, everyone. Yes, this is the book, Too Big to Jail, published by Macmillan. I started looking into this story, and I mean, Andy used the word treasure chest. It's a cliche, I know, but I'd say it's a story that keeps on giving. I mean, it is literally a gift that keeps on giving. And at the end of it, when I put my pen down, or actually when I stopped typing, I found myself, even though the fact I was writing it, more and more at every level, I was just shocked by what I was uncovering. And it's got everything in it. I mean, if you want to encapsulate everything that's wrong with the banking industry, everything that's wrong with our attitude as a society to banking, of politicians to banking, bankers themselves, and their frankly sometimes bizarre behavior, it's all there and more. I'm not going to plug it anymore. Brian is a professional plugger. And I'll hand over to Brian, who can ask some searching questions of me. Hello, Brian.
You'll need to take yourself off mute, please, Brian, first of all.
Brian, you're on mute.
I know that. Okay, Christopher, yes, thank you.
Chris.
That was a barb. He doesn't like being called Christopher. I thought I'd get booted.
Yeah.
Right. Shall we look, Chris, you're terrifically well known in the Fleet Street, as it used to be, and in the city, but you're not, despite a striking similarity in looks, you're not as well known as, say, Tom Cruise or something. So
most unfair.
what I want to do is really talk about, set you up. Who are you? Well,
okay.
I thought I'd tell you to start with. I thought I'd tell you who you are, because you're the chap who was set by somebody many, many years ago to investigate me. And I well remember the first meeting we had, which was in a restaurant called Daphne's in Primrose Hill. And you were very suspicious of me because you thought I was some sort of deep and dark person. I think probably influenced by a chap called Richard Branson all those years ago, because I was working for British Airways. But I soon convinced you, I think, of my relative honesty, and became to rather, I hate to say this, because came to rather admire you, not just because of your enviable ability to be able to write, which you do effortlessly, it seems, but also because you have a background which extends beyond Fleet Street. I mean, I don't know whether I know you got a law degree at Cambridge. Did you ever practice as a solicitor?
No, I did law because, so I grew up in the north of England and went to a state grammar school. Hardly anyone from my school ever went to Oxbridge. I got in to do law because my careers master said I was good at history and English and I should do law, which is actually, for any lawyers on the call, about the worst advice you can give. Lawyers are analytical, and if anything, maths and science is better training for law. It's not a discursive subject, and I liked it in the first year. I liked constitutional law and criminal law, and then we started hitting land law and trusts, and law and I started falling out. But I did carry on, and I went to a city law firm called Cameron Markby. Cameron Markby was very well known. When I watch reruns of, talking of Tom Cruise, actually, when I watch reruns of John Grisham's The Firm starring Tom Cruise, it reminds me very, very much of Cameron Markby. Cameron Markby had a godfather-like senior partner called John Karma, who never spoke to anyone in the firm, I think, who wasn't a partner. He always wore a camel coat. He got in the lift, never said a word to anyone. He was Tiny Rowland's lawyer. Tiny Rowland was the very aggressive takeover king, the unacceptable face of capitalism, as Ted Heath called him. And but I did learn a very quick lesson, which I'll relay, which is I answered an ad for a lawyer who wants to be a journalist. And I ended up at a law magazine, part of Euromoney. And my parents were shocked because they got this vision of their little boy setting up his own law firm. My father, this true story, my father found a law firm in Preston called Blackhurst and Blackhurst. And he had this crazy idea it would be Blackhurst, Blackhurst and Blackhurst, bonkers. And I'd been at the law magazine about 4 weeks, and I then got an invitation from Cameron Markby to go and have lunch with John Karma. I don't think John Karma even knew I'd been at the law firm for 2 years. But he spent the entire lunch telling me how brilliant everyone was and how brilliant lawyer Cameron Markby was. And the lesson was that it was about the power of the press. that even somebody like that needed the press. But I suppose, just finally, having worked in a city law firm and been in the city on the front line, as it were, it gave me a very good grounding for what was to follow.
Well, that's it, Chris. And I'm pleased you've talked about that at some length, because that's what's given you, in my view, quite a lot of your grounding. Just as a parenthesis, of course, I suspect that you were working for Cameron Markby, who was representing Tiny Rowlands, when I was working for Mohammed Al-Fayed, attempting to destroy him, which I eventually successfully did by analysing his account. And that's another story. There we are. I had to get a puff in there, Chris. So I know from there, I'm going to canter through. I mean, I know you've won many, many press awards. I know you went on as a city editor of the Evening Standard and went through the banking crisis, which gives you a very good grounding for your present book. Editor of the Independent, then to Euromoney, Business Magazine, Sunday Times, Express, Independent Observer, Standard, and then Indie, and then the Indie, you know, again, which was your editor there. And that's a hell of a record. I must say that the title of your book is almost an essay in itself. It's Too Big to Jail: Inside HSBC, Mexican Drug Cartels, and the greatest banking scandal of the century, which indeed it is. I think it would be helpful if you were just to talk about, I'll go straight into that. I want you to talk about the El Capo people. El Chapo, because it's extraordinary. I mean, we always think of financial matters being a sort of victimless crime, despite the chaos of the 2008 banking crisis. But El Chapo, I've been reading up on him. I mean, in your book and elsewhere, which I, by the way, bought on Kindle because you didn't send me a copy, but there we are. And I know, but I mean, they were evil. They were sort of leaving headless corpses around.
Yeah, I mean, what fascinated me, the origin of this book, well, if it's possible to have two origins, I was very much aware of this story when I was city editor of the Standard, that the HSBC had been fined the largest amount in American history, $1.9 billion, for facilitating the laundering of money for the Sinaloa drugs cartel, which is the #1 drugs organization in the world. And it was one of those stories that occasionally you get this in Fleet Street, where a big story breaks and almost certainly, almost immediately something else happens and it gets parked. And that's really what happened here. It never got the coverage it deserved. Roll forward to 2020, 21. I was at HSBC with somebody who used to work there at Canary Wharf, and on the way back on the tube, we were talking about the bank, and he literally said one word: Mexico. And that night, I do what everyone on this call does. I Googled, and I started Googling HSBC Mexico and realized this story had never been properly told. So that's one thing. The second thing is I had met and interviewed at length Stephen Green, who was the chief executive, then executive chairman of HSBC, who espoused ethical capitalism.
Yeah.
He's an ordained priest. And I was fascinated as to how it was that a bank run by Stephen Green, that stood for discipline and was almost run on colonial lines. I mean, that's how it was for decades, how it was that it got into bed with a man like Chapo. And the more I looked at Chapo, what I saw was that on one side, you've got a bank that has incredible ambition, run by men with incredible ambitions. On the other side, you've got a drugs cartel, which is also run by men with incredible ambition. Now, obviously, Chapo is a barbaric thug, and he kills people, and they kill people in the most gruesome ways imaginable. But if you put that on one side, what you have with the Sinaloa is a massive business It's as big as a multinational. It supplies drugs to every major city across North America, and they're drugs of every type. I mean, all illegal. It employs thousands of people. It sources its own product. It supplies, I mean, I'm using the language of business here rather than language of drugs, but it's a massive logistics business. And then, of course, and the final bit, at the end of all this, they are left with enormous amounts of money. And the more I looked into it, I saw this parallel, the bank and the cartel, both of which had a declared aim, which was to be the number one in the world.
Yes, exactly. I mean, you know, I think I recall from the book, do I recall from the book, that there was a raid on somewhere and they picked up 2.5 tons of $100 bills. Is that?
I mean, what that was there's a guy in Mexico City called Yagon, who's actually Chinese origin, and he was thought by the Mexicans to be making. He was a pharmaceutical guy, and he was thought to be making crystal meth for the Sinaloa. And when they raided his mansion, they found $204 million in cash. It's the world's biggest ever haul of cash. And you're right, it weighs 2.5 tons. It went right through the house. I mean, down the stair, in a bedroom, down the stairs, in the hall, there were piles and piles of cash. He actually is important in the book because when they started looking at his bank accounts, they found even more money, and all the bank accounts were with HSBC. He was actually a personal customer of HSBC. But what that showed is that if you're selling drugs on the street, and Chapo was selling drugs on the street, he was employing people right across North America every night, and he kept meticulous records, and they're in the book, of selling marijuana, heroin, crystal meth, you name it, to anybody, you know, across all the big cities. This isn't a credit card business, it's a cash business. He got dollar bills in return. They're often grubby and dirty. I mean, we use the phrase dirty money, but they really are dirty. These are from people doing drugs on the street. He ends up with piles and piles of cash. Now, contrary to what we saw in the film Scarface, when they go into a bank and they've got a holdall full of cash for Joe Montana, that cannot happen. That cannot happen in real life. You cannot go into a bank in the United States with a holdall full of cash and expect not to be alert. You know, the alarms go off. You're seen on camera. You'll be taken to one side. You will be asked specifically where that money's from. And so Chapo's problem was he had, and we're talking billions of dollars. He had billions of dollars in the United States. He had to do something with them. He brought them back to Mexico down the same routes he was using to smuggle the drugs in. And then he had to find somewhere, a bank to put them. And that bank turned out to be HSBC.
Most extraordinary story, Chris. And I know a little bit about this, you know, the barriers on taking cash, because one of my friends was chief executive of Christie's, and they had a Fabergé egg for sale. And one day, 2 Russians walked in carrying bags and said, "We want to buy the egg." And Christopher Davidge said, "Well, certainly, you know." And they said, "No, we want it now." And opened the cases, and they had $5 million in it. And he said, "No." And they got so nasty that when Christie's opened in Moscow, he had to be supplied with military grade protection because they got so. So these people are these absolutely true.
Yeah.
These people are bloody evil. And how is it that? How is it that Stephen Green didn't know about it? I mean, I happen to know Stephen Green. I had lunch.
Let me fill in some background here. So in 2002, HSBC was named the best run bank in the world. Now, that for anyone or most people, that would be a pretty triumphant moment, you know, to be named the best run bank in the world. But for HSBC and its bosses, that wasn't enough. And for its investors and the institutional investors, the city was always sniping at HSBC. They felt it could be doing better, making bigger returns. And one of the themes of this book is our obsession with big. We, as a society, you know, a car is no good unless it's a big car. A yacht is no good unless it's a big yacht. A house is no good unless it's a big house. And that applies to business. A business is no good unless it's a big business. So they took a conscious decision to become the #1 bank in the world in terms of size. That meant they had to buy banks. They weren't prepared to wait to grow organically, probably a fatal mistake. They decided to buy banks all over the world, and they did. They bought them in Argentina, Brazil, and they bought a bank in Mexico called Bital. Bital was the 5th biggest bank in Mexico. Now, for reasons I cannot fathom, something to do with men and testosterone. I mean, Harriet Harman, and I mocked her at the time, actually, but I now take it all back. In 2008, Harriet Harman said, if women had been running the banks, there wouldn't have been a banking crisis. I think she's absolutely right. They, at HSBC, they were so determined to acquire this, and remember, the 5th biggest bank wasn't the biggest bank in Mexico by any means, a tiny bank. They gave it a code name, which was Project High Noon, which, as most people know, is a cowboy film starring Gary Cooper. They bought this bank because it's called Project High Noon. They were desperate to stop their rivals getting into Mexico. They identified Mexico. It was the time of the BRICS profile by Jim O'Neill at Goldman Sachs, the economist. And they thought that these emerging markets, and Mexico was in the next tier down, they thought they were going to be the bee's knees. They piled into Mexico. They were warned repeatedly by the Mexican authorities and by their own people, they're all in the book. This is not a bank that really does compliance. It was based in the northwest of Mexico, which is actually the Sinaloa's heartland, near the American border. But the thought was, well, they're HSBC, they will bring to it all their sort of, you know, fancy London ways. They will sort it out because they know what they're doing, blah, blah, blah. Well, they didn't. What happened was they bought the bank, promptly set off on this massive expansion, renaming it HSBC Mexico. And meanwhile, the bosses in London, instead of getting to grips with this bank in Mexico, they were buying more and more things all over the world. And they bought a big business in America called Household, a big consumer lending business. They set up their own investment bank, if you remember, because if you're going to be the #1 in the world and you're entirely driven by greed and ambition, then you have to, you know, you're trying to become Citibank and Bank of America. On the investment banking side, you're trying to be JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs. So these are big, big plays. This isn't a sort of a bank saying, yeah, we're going to move into Kent or we're going to try and corner Essex. This is a bank trying to take over the world. And while they were trying to take over the world, in Mexico, and it's a bit like Heart of Darkness, which, as we know, became the film Apocalypse Now, where the theme is that, you know, there's a colonel in the jungle far away from headquarters who's out of control. Well, that's exactly what happened. Mexico, a long way from Canary Wharf, was out of control.
Yeah, well, look, that's a familiar story, isn't it? You know, the city, I've long maintained, and you know this, that the city, the investment community, has a great burden on its shoulders of guilt. when it comes to driving growth in the banking sector. I mean, you know, I think Ian Fraser might be on this call. Is he? At risk of plugging another book in your space, Chris, he's written a great book called Shredded about Royal Bank of Scotland, which you know, and that was driven by the poor and stupidly named Fred the Shred, Fred the Shred, lionized by the city, going for growth. And we've got the, can you hear? And you've got the really awful.
We've lost now.
If for some reason we lose contact temporarily with Chris, we'll just open things up because there's so much in the book to talk about.
I'll just carry on talking. I'll just carry on talking for a second, Andy. It's a theme I know that Chris agrees with, so we can talk about it. And you mentioned earlier, of course, HBOS, which brought Lloyds down, and that was a drive for growth. Victor Blank was terribly keen to acquire HBOS because it gave him the growth he wanted. So it's a most extraordinary thing. What Chris has talked about in the book and is very keen on, I know, is the role of Stephen Green. You know, Stephen Green moved into government. He's now Lord Green. He's had roles in government. And it's a most extraordinary thing that the Americans wanted to prosecute HSBC, but George Osborne intervened and persuaded them not to, which seems to me to be extraordinary. And of course, George Osborne has gone on to a senior role at one of the biggest investment organizations in the world, BlackRock. So it's a very incestuous world. And I know that what Chris is concerned about, and indeed I'm concerned about, and you are, is where all this stops. Because if you have banking crime, to the extent that we know that there is banking crime, what happens? We've had the 2008 banking crisis, which was based on appalling behavior. Jared has written about Iceland. Nobody's been arrested in the UK. And as something, Andy, that you and I are both keen on, which is Violation Tracker, which I plug mercilessly to everybody I meet, they will show you, that wonderful sort of resource will show you that banking is 8 times more transgressive than the next sector, which I think is oil. So what are we going to do about this terrible, almost criminal thread that seems to be running through banking? I want to stop there, Chris. I was just filling in because you're gone.
Yeah, sorry, I lost the connection. I live right under the flight path, and occasionally, I'm sure it's the plane. You know, things get. Well, to pick on what you said, this was blatant money laundering. I mean, in one trip in one visit, a guy deposited. Imagine you're in a bank, and the bloke in front of you is depositing $933,000 in cash. Now, I don't know about you, but I'd be sort of huffing and tapping my foot and telling him to get a move on, mate. But you can't do that with these people. You get killed. He deposited 933,000. Chapo got so cozy with the whole thing. He had special boxes made, pouches that fitted under the teller's windows, which were stuffed full of cash. But even that wasn't enough for Chapo. His problem then was that he ended up with, in Mexico by law, accounts are held in pesos. The peso is not an international currency. You can't buy anything with a peso. He wanted American dollars. So the irony was he got dollars in cash, but he wanted dollars in a bank account. And HSBC, now they didn't know, I mean, obviously they didn't deal with Chapo himself. They thought they were dealing with farmers in northwest Mexico. You'd think that their alarm bells would be going off, thinking, who the hell are all these farmers? But in the book, I talk about a woman who, she grew avocados and melons in her backyard. And in 1 month, she deposited $350,000 in cash. I mean, you can't make, I was going to say, you can't make this stuff up. Sadly, it's true. They said to these people, hey, we've got, what about the Cayman Islands? we've got the Cayman Islands, and you can route your money through HSBC Mexico in the Cayman Islands through our branch there. Now, this is where it gets really, really appalling from I believe, which was the complicity in this. That there is no branch of HSBC Mexico in the Cayman Islands. Everyone thinks, when you say a branch of a bank, everyone thinks of a building with steps, an ATM machine, a counter, a lobby, and so on. That's a bank. This wasn't a branch. This was all done on desktop in Mexico City. So you paid your money into your account in Mexico. They would then transfer it electronically to an account in the Cayman Islands. And that meant in Cayman Islands, you can hold accounts in dollars. This meant that Chapo was able to spend his money. And it meant that he could buy guns. It meant he could buy, the guy had midget submarines to take his drugs up the coast. He could buy planes. The Cayman Islands branch of HSBC Mexico, the Americans were convinced was the source of 13 aircraft, 13 that Chapo bought to ferry drugs. 60,000 new accounts were opened in a little over a year. Those accounts held $1.2 billion. Now, you would think that everything would be flashing red at Canary Wharf. Quite the reverse. What happened was that and I've used this word already, 2 words really, hubris and testosterone, but they took over, and they'd already built in Mexico City the biggest tower in Mexico. For some reason, banks always have to have giant phalluses pointing into the sky with their name on top. So that's the first thing they did. The second thing was they started really exploiting this business. And Stephen Green announced to an AGM that they'd gone through the billion dollar revenue earnings in Mexico, and they were overjoyed. They'd invested in Mexico, and this money was pouring in. They never really bothered to find out where it was coming from. Their people on the ground knew. They were the actual, and I feel sorry for these people, the people in the banks themselves, they were petrified. What would happen was that an associate of Chapo would get to the front of the queue, they'd flash, he'd hold up his hand, and in his hand would be a picture, probably of the teller's children or their boyfriend or partner. And the message was, we know who you are, we know where you live. And in Mexico, there's a well-known phrase called the silver or the lead. You take the money, you either take the money, which is the silver, or if you don't, you take the lead, which is a bullet. And you'd think, though, with that background, that would alert HSBC, quite the reverse. What happened was, and I'm jumping forward, eventually the Americans had had enough. They really had. They could see the volumes. The HSBC Mexico was dealing in more American dollars than any of the other banks combined. So they moved against it big time. They wanted to throw the book at HSBC, and they wanted to jail the people at the top of the bank and people at various levels. They wanted to bring prosecutions. This was the Department of Justice, and jail, picking up on where Brian was before I had to drop off, jail is the one thing, in my view, that anyone understands. Finding a bank is not dissimilar from finding a Premiership footballer a week's wages. When those fines are announced, when Paul Pogba is fined a week's wages, like probably everyone else, I just laugh and think, God, that's going to hit him hard like hell. Same with a bank. The one thing that they understand is the loss of personal reputation. The finding a bank is the cost of doing business. It's written down as a cost. They keep their jobs, and jail means you can't go to the opera. Jail means you can't play golf. Jail means your wife gets snubbed at the school gate. Those things really hurt. But we have never, as far as I'm aware, actually, and I think I've checked, I don't think we've ever jailed ever a senior banker in this country. I can't think when we ever have.
No,
we certainly didn't in 2008, and we didn't here. And the Americans wanted to, and George Osborne, the Treasury, intervened and said, if you prosecute these bankers, you run the risk of bringing down the bank, and you run the risk of bringing down the entire banking system. That argument was used in 2008 when I was city editor of the Standard. And I'll just give you one little vignette, which is, in this country, I really believe we do not take white collar crime, financial crime seriously enough. In America, we're used to seeing what they call the perp walk, which is, the guy coming out literally in chains, with his hands in chains, shuffling along the road into the back of a van. That's what they do in America, and they jail people with big sentences. Here, we don't. And just a thought on this. Some years ago, or not that long ago, I was talking to John Moscow, who's a legendary attorney in Manhattan, he's a friend of mine. He is the guy who busted BCCI. And John said to me, he's got a very dry, droll wit, and he said to me, can I ask you something? And I said, what? He said, do we agree that New York and London are the same size in terms of finance and influence and status in the world? And I said, well, yeah, just about. They've got different strengths and weaknesses, but they're similar. He said, why is it then that in Manhattan last year, we prosecuted, and he gave a figure, and I think it was well into the tens of bankers, brokers, all sorts of people for financial crime and fraud. And he said, and in London, you didn't prosecute any at all.
Yeah,
that's so that true. Tells you everything. We do not take financial crime seriously enough.
Well, you're so right, Chris. I mean, the only bankers I know in the world who've been prosecuted in Europe, in the world really, are Iceland, where some people went to jail, as Jared pointed out in his book, and in Ireland, where some bankers actually went to jail, but nowhere else. And it's scandalous.
I just want to tell Jared, because this actually also shows you how little research the city ever does. So shortly after the Icelandic banking crisis, I was best man at a wedding in Iceland, and it was a city wedding. And we all flew to Keflavik, to the main airport, and we had to get on a bus and go out to the far west of Iceland, which is where the reception was. And as we were driving along, this guy got a big, well-known city figure, and the bus was full of people from the city. And he turned to everyone on the bus and he said, boys, we've been had. And we said, what do you mean? And he said, there's nothing here apart from lava, rock and fish. And he was right. There were no underlying assets. There was nothing. There was the Icelandic fishing fleet, some tin, and that was it. And yet this island was owning half the British high street, tons of commercial property, banks galore. There was no underlying strength of the economy. Yet, and this is, repeat myself, for the people on the bus, and certainly for that guy, this was a revelation. They'd never been to Iceland, and yet they've been doing tons of banking, tons of transactions on the back of Iceland, but they'd never got off their chairs in the square mile in London and actually gone there to see what the hell it was.
Well, they were
So,
driven, obviously, Chris, you know this, they were driven by fees and the chance of,
yeah,
I was advising John Hodson, the chairman of Singer and Friedlander, when Kaupting bid for them, the Icelandic bank. And I tried to look into Kaupting and I could see its balance sheet, but I couldn't work out where it was all coming from. So I looked at the Iceland economy and I said to John, there isn't that much cod in the sea. I don't get it. And but Casino, who were the not to be gainsaid brokers, the kings of the city of the day, said you've got to accept the bid. It's the most extraordinary thing. Most extraordinary thing. Now look,
the one thing we've not mentioned as well, though, is that one of the reasons the Americans, that George Osborne possibly was so keen for the Americans not to prosecute, was that, and this comes to something that Andy mentioned at the very beginning, which is the revolving door. By the time the Americans wanted to bring prosecutions against HSBC, Stephen Green was actually Lord Green, and he was a trade minister in the David Cameron, George Osborne government.
Huh. Yeah.
And there's a scene in the book, which was when I first heard about it, I had to check it really happened, and it did, which was that on becoming trade minister, one of Stephen Green's first tasks was to organize and take a trade mission to Mexico. So he actually he actually had a trade mission in Mexico. They were having a party, a reception in the president's garden, and he he made a speech extolling the virtues of Mexico and trade in Mexico. A few blocks away, the Mexicans were poring over the records of HSBC Mexico and supplying information to the DEA and CIA in America.
Well, look, it's totally crooked. I call that deferred corruption. You know, it's people looking over the horizon to the next job. I must say, I think that it's extraordinary that people like Tony Blair went on to work at JP Morgan. That's another story. But I know that Andy has been doing solid work on and I'd like to, as a general observer of the financial scene, Chris, I'd like to take see what you think about the FCA's decision not to prosecute anybody at HBOS, because, you know, I've been following this for a long time. I was tangentially involved in getting those 6 bankers banged up for a total of 50 years. And I took a wonderful document called the Turnbull Report, which was produced by Thames Valley Police by an in-house risk manager of HBOS, who had sort of backstage clearance, you know, it could go anywhere. And they have named 15 senior directors and executives as culpable, starting with the chap called Rob Stevenson, going on to James Crosby, and over to Andy Hornby. Now, all those people are now sitting there very comfortably on their pensions, and Andy Hornby's gone on to another big job. What do you think should be done about that?
Well, what should be done is that they should be prosecuted if there's a case, and it sounds like there is, and certainly that report said they were culpable. I mean, look, prosecution, you know, bring the prosecution, but it comes back to partly our attitude to this sort of crime. The second thing is, on the back of our attitude, we do not fund our police forces properly. We do not train our police forces properly, so that, I mean, they get assessed on how many people they pick up for breaking and entering, or you know, shoplifting and things like that. You know, they have a culture as well. They do not want to be. They're not. You know, they don't want to be bogged down in a fraud investigation that might take years. That's part of the culture that needs changing. They need to be educated that actually, guys, this really matters. Another thing, people like Andy Hornby and Crosby and the rest, they will do what everyone can do with money. They can hire the most expensive lawyers. and they will go immediately to one of the big city firms. The big city firm will put every obstacle in possible in the path of the investigation and drag it down. The next thing is, we don't have laws in this country that really, we're not as advanced, in my view, as the Americans in terms of surveillance, admission of private materials, tape recordings, etc., etc. We're very hesitant. We don't like doing that. The Americans get good results because they do that. They're very good at turning people on investigations. They do plea bargains. We don't like plea bargains in this country, so we don't really have. We don't like whistleblowers. Our whistleblowing laws are pathetic. So all of it adds up. And then, of course, you have on top of all this a culture where the people who run the banks, who then, as I've said previously, some of them end up with jobs in government, and they're all from the same social strata. They're all from the same social class. They all go to London might be a major financial centre. It's actually a fairly small town if you're at that level. If you go to the opera and you're chairman of a bank, you're waving across the seats at your mates because they're there as well, also in the best seats. And nobody's paid for these seats apart from the bank. And they're all in that same social strata, same schools, same golf clubs, same, they move in the same circles. Psychologically, it is very hard to jail one of your friends. That's the psychology. We don't like doing it. And if you look at the if you look at the police, if you look at the Met, they're a million miles away from the people at the top of banks. They don't speak the language, they don't know what they're talking about, etc., etc. And it's no surprise to me that there are so few cases, and it's no surprise that the HBOS people, not the 6, but the HBOS people at the top are walking free and have actually gone on and had even better careers. No surprise at all.
It is extraordinary, Chris. Look, I know that Andy we've been talking for too long, possibly. I mean, to my mind, it's a sort of force field, a constructive force field that protects these people, and it is quite wrong. We need an SEC, we need an FBI, and all that sort of thing. But Andy, look, handing back to you, I think you should do. We're getting a bit touched with the end.
That's already been remarkably interesting, and I know there are lots of people who want to come in with comments and questions. We'll kind of open it up to general Q&A and discussion shortly. Brian and Chris, thank you so much for what you've covered so far. It really has been extremely interesting. Chris, there's a few particular points I'd like to make. Firstly, I said at the beginning, I think your book is excellent. It really is. It really is. How somebody can do something so intensive and so detailed is really, really impressive. There's a piece in the book that I had to stop and think about what I just heard because I was listening to it on Audible. It was the bit in the book, Chris, where HSBC actually changed the architecture of the windows where the tellers work to enable it to be easier for the criminals to pass the money over. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? Because I think it's really significant because it shows HSBC were effectively partnering with these murderous bastards. And that's where, to my mind, any idea that maybe HSBC didn't really understand what was going on, that just went out the window when I heard that bit.
Yeah, actually, you slightly, I hate to steal your thunder, you slightly misheard. That was a claim that was made repeatedly by people involved. When I checked it out, though, I couldn't find that actually happened. What that is in the book. What did happen was that Chapo had he called them pouches. They were more
Yes.
like boxes, specially made. But to come back to this, there was no doubt at all as to what was going on. I mean, we're not talking 1 million, 2 million, tens of millions, hundreds of millions. We are talking billions of dollars in cash coming into a bank in Mexico. And these are dollar bills in small denominations that people have used to buy drugs. And the volumes were colossal. And as I said, that they opened accounts in the names of farmers, shopkeepers, bar owners, but when they opened accounts, they had to fill in forms saying, what's your annual income, or how much do you expect to be putting in, and they give a figure. And one guy, I think from memory, he said that his income was $50,000 or something, whatever it was, and in 1 year he was depositing several million. And this was going, so it was blatant. They all knew. The people in Mexico knew. The people at the headquarters in Mexico knew. You couldn't ignore these volumes. They were so massive. But because of the hierarchical structure of HSBC, because the people at the very top were more interested in, buying another bank, and they were telling the people in Mexico, "Oh, you deal with it." The warning signs, nothing was done.
You emphasize there, Chris, unwittingly perhaps, but perhaps it in your mind, of the importance of whistleblower legislation, which we haven't really got in this country, which was extraordinarily imported from the UK. It was a piece of legislation, you're the lawyer, Key Tam, which goes back to King John, 1360s or something.
Yeah.
And
well, in the book, one of the key people, there were three separate investigations that all happened at the same time, 3 lines of inquiry in the States. There was a New York cop called Frankie Di Gregorio, who busted a guy in Queens in New York, thinking he was a medium-sized dealer, money man. Anyway, when they realized he was a much bigger fish, all his money was with HSBC, and they saw HSBC. He started looking at HSBC. A district attorney in West Virginia busted a guy on a Medicare fraud that was so blatant. He was banking with HSBC, and this guy, I mean, talk about, inspired. He said, hang on a minute, if HSBC are taking money from this bloke, but it's clearly fraud, what else are they doing? He was in the mountains of West Virginia. And then I get to the guy, there's a guy called Everett Stern. Everett Stern applied to join the CIA. He wanted to join the CIA. He set his heart on joining the spooks. He failed the interview or the recruitment process. He then answered an ad for an international bank that was to join its anti-money laundering department. That bank was HSBC. He went to their anti-money laundering department, such as it was in Delaware, in the States, and he was so horrified by what he was seeing coming across his screen that he literally contacted the same person who interviewed him for a job in the CIA and said, I can help you. I'm seeing stuff here that's unbelievable. And they said, as you'd expect, tell us more. And he became a whistleblower. What we don't have, and his contribution was massive. But what we don't have in the UK is a culture. We are all brought up to hate grasses and snitches. Well, there's a point when grassing and snitching is for the public good, and we don't admire those. We don't do anything to protect those people. In any walk of life, but particularly in the city, if you break cover in the city, you are not going to be employed in the city ever again. You are saying goodbye to a career in whatever it is, finance, law, accountancy. You will not be employed. Whatever they say, your career is over. And we do not do enough to encourage whistleblowing and to protect whistleblowing.
Thank you. And another point that comes out really strongly in the book is this whole idea of a deferred prosecution agreement, which was negotiated between HSBC and the authorities in the US. And as you pointed out earlier, my understanding is that the actual authorities in the US simply wanted to prosecute the bankers and go down the normal route, but it was George Osborne and the stop that from happening.
George Osborne, once they'd been persuaded by Osborne not to prosecute individual, not to bring a criminal prosecution, they then went for what's known as a DPA, Deferred Prosecution Agreement, where they fined HSBC. The fine was $1.9 billion, which was a record, still is a record. It's actually only 5 weeks profits. But as part of this DPA, HSBC agreed to enter a sort of rehab program. And in their case, it actually lasted 6 years. The point about this is, though, or 2 points. Once you take the decision not to bring a criminal prosecution and go for jail, once you take that decision and you enter into a DPA, and this is in the book, it becomes a negotiation. And bankers, senior bankers, are practiced negotiators. That's what they do. They negotiate takeovers and financing. And so it became a negotiation between the HSBC legal team and the Department of Justice. Well, once you start doing that, the balance tips. The balance moves away from the Department of Justice. It's now a negotiation. That's one thing. The second thing, though, is that for anyone on this call who is, if you're arrested, now I'm not saying anyone on this call is a drug dealer, but if you are arrested, you can't, as an individual, you cannot negotiate with the police. The Crown Prosecution Service come at you, and you're going to go to court. In America, if you're a drug dealer and you're caught 3 times, we all know the phrase, 3 strikes and you're out. You end up in some states with a life sentence, and life in America means life. It's life without parole, and that's non-negotiable. So, but if you're a bank and you're laundering the money, or the money is being laundered through your bank, you can enter apparently into a negotiation and do a DPA.
Yeah.
Now, there is another aspect to the DPA, which to my mind is worrying, because we live in very straitened times for public finance all over the world, not just in the UK, but all over the world. If you're fining somebody $1.9 billion, that's a bonanza for the US Department of Justice. It's cash they've never seen $1.9 billion before in their lives. And that money is paid, a proportion of that money is paid out to the people who, to the organizations that did the investigating. They are hard up. So Frankie Di Gregorio, who I interview in the book, is a fantastic New York cop. I mean, he's straight out of Central Casting, and his office in Queens in New York got I think it was $100 million out of the HSBC pot. They were able to use that money. They didn't give it to themselves. They're not allowed to do that. They used it to build new premises and new offices that they desperately needed.
Yeah.
So you go from a situation where you're not going to prosecute, you're going to bring a fine, and that fine becomes a source of revenue for the central authorities. The same thing happens here at the Serious Fraud Office. Lisa Osofsky, who actually was one of those people involved with the monitoring of HSBC at the time on the rehab program. She is the director of the SFO, Serious Fraud Office here, and she is a great advocate of deferred prosecution agreements. Why? Because here the Treasury, they judge the SFO not on how many people go to prison, which is hardly any, but on how much money they bring in. Because the more money they bring in, there's less pressure on their funding. So we're now in this strange world, which is, as I repeat, is excluded to everyone else on the call. If I step out of my house now and I'm arrested in the street, you know, I hit someone, I can't negotiate with the police. You know, they're going to, you know, I'll be in the magistrates.
Chris, thank you, Chris. If I may, I'll just cover off a few other points before we open up for Q&A. It's such an exciting and interesting conversation. No need to dwell on this point, but it was remarkable that even once HSBC had been fined and they'd been put into special measures or, you know, made to behave properly, even after that point, there was resistance and there was pushback. They were still trying to not provide the reports. They were still trying to not authentically look into all the cases. There was a huge backlog. They didn't take it seriously. It was just like a cosmetic exercise to look as though they were doing their job properly in rectifying anything. Anything you'd like to mention in relation to that?
I mean, well, that's certainly true. And what happened? I mean, HSBC was fined as recently as December last year. So we're only talking 8-9 months ago by the FCA in this country. They were fined £93 million for lax money laundering controls. 93 million is neither here nor there. It's an accounting error in HSBC terms. But this comes back to a culture where, first of all, they don't fear that, they know they're not going to be jailed. There's no fear there. The second thing is these banks, whatever they say, and I will, you know, if they want to come after me on this, I'll take them on. They do not take compliance seriously enough. Compliance, I mean, you know, compliance is the equivalent in football of being the referee. You're the guy who holds the game up. You know, you blow the whistle. I score a fantastic goal, the referee blows a whistle. I'm a spoil sport. That is compliance. That is how it's seen in the city. Nobody in compliance earns frontline fees for the bank, and they get in the way, and they're often not even in the same building as the top bankers. They're often outside, and you know, the sharpest brains in the bank, or not put that another way, people in compliance are very intelligent, don't get me wrong, but the sharpest banking brains, the ones who bring in the deals, the ones who bring in the massive mandates and the fees and the huge funding syndicate, you know, all that stuff, that is not done by the people in compliance. And, you know, they will say, oh, of course we take compliance seriously. Well, I say, yeah, my response is, yeah, right.
Yeah. And Chris, when the book explains that there were some heroes in HSBC, people who said, I haven't got enough resource to do the right level of monitoring on anti-money laundering, suspicious reports, but they didn't get the resource they needed, or they had to beg, steal and borrow to get it. There clearly wasn't a great willingness to actually govern the bank properly.
They launched, I mean, the incredible thing really was that not only were they intent on making the bank bigger and growing its, growing its revenues, but being bankers, they couldn't help themselves. So at the same time that they were growing the bank, they actually embarked on a cost-cutting exercise right across the bank to save money, to boost the figures even more. Well, guess which bits they cut.
Mm.
I think, from memory, they went through five compliance directors for the bit that covered Mexico in I think it was 18 months. I can't remember, I have to look it up, but it was, and the Americans actually were all over this, and they were saying, what the hell are you doing? And they even, there's a section in the book where the American authorities said in no uncertain terms to HSBC, we do not rate the person that you've put in. And this person had no compliance background. She was a fast track graduate executive on HSBC's rapid promotion scheme. She was put there. She had nothing qualified this person at all to be overseeing what was going on in Mexico. And the Americans pointed this out to them. And okay, they removed her. What they actually did was kept her, they actually bumped her up. They put somebody else in, and that new person had to report still to her. I mean, it's mind-boggling, really. But I'm afraid, I mean, Brian very kindly, or somebody read out the full title of the book, which is The Greatest Banking Scandal of the Century. And I am tempted, although it wouldn't be the sexiest bit to stick on the end, I am tempted to write so far, because
Yes,
we're talking about HBOS, we're talking about Lloyd's HBOS, we're talking about HSBC, we talked about Royal Bank of Scotland. We're only at 2022. There's plenty more to come, because they do not learn the lessons and they do not care. And more to the point, they are not made to learn the lessons, and they're not made to care.
Andy, sorry, just 1 second. I want to pick up on something that Chris said. Chris, you've talked about funding as being terribly important, which of course it is. By contrast to the American system, I should remind you, I'm sure you know, that when Thames Valley Police prosecuted what became called the Reading Six and got them banged up for 50 years, people who pushed that through, Anthony Stansfeld, the Police and Crime Commissioner, and a chap called Chief Superintendent Toole, and they spent, and they had to fight their way, because it cost them £7 million, which came out of their budget, came straight out of the budget, and they couldn't get it from Treasury. So all the other, I think they're called KPIs, aren't they? Managements, key performance indicators. They couldn't hit. So they suffered directly. Now, the man at the centre of all this is the man you've already mentioned, which is George Osborne. Don't forget that George Osborne, we've worried about and we're concerned, I know Andy's very concerned about the FCA report on HBOS. Well, you've got to remember that there was, once upon a time, a very good head of the FCA. His name was Martin Wheatley. And he said, when he took over, he was so outraged by what was going on, he said, I'm going to shoot first and ask questions afterwards, which is really the American way. And what happened to him? George Osborne sacked him to protect him. George Osborne at Treasury wouldn't pay up for help Thames Valley Police. And the reason that those people who were deemed culpable, all 15 of them, starting with Lord Dennis Stevenson, Andy Hornby, and James Crosby, they all escaped prosecution because Thames Valley couldn't afford it. Yeah,
I mean, we have a major issue in this country with police funding generally. We've removed bobbies from the beat. We've closed police stations. I mean, they've all gone, and nobody within that. I mean, that's bad enough. And then we are saying we need more money to investigate fraud, and they're saying, yeah, but the problem with fraud is that and financial crime is that it's very complicated. You're asking people who aren't qualified to wade through thousands, if not millions of transactions. You're using terminology, language, procedures that they do not understand, they're not equipped for. At the very end, it would have to go before a jury, and we don't trust our juries. I disagree on this, by the way. I think we should trust our juries more, but we have a doubt that juries can take this sort of stuff on. They've certainly got to clear their diaries for 6 months to a year. We all remember how long some of these trials do take. And it all comes down to an issue of funding. And we need a properly funded national financial crime agency, staffed with accountants, lawyers, if we can persuade them, bankers who want to actually, do some good in their lives and perhaps be deserving of an honor rather than one they've bought. And, with police side by side, and have the power to seize documents, seize computers, go in, and if Clifford Chance, Linklaters and Paynes, Freshfields, all those firms say, "Oh, you can't do that," you say, as you said, you shoot first, fire later. You say, "Get lost. We are taking this stuff. We'll see you in court." But we don't have that, I'm afraid. We're a long way from it. And the phrase, just leave you one thought, and it's in the book, but the war on drugs was started by Ronald Reagan a long time ago. And there's this massive thing, the war on drugs. Drugs is still the biggest problem, one of the biggest problems facing our society all over the world. The war on drugs has had absolutely zero impact. It's a war that's been lost. What we've done in that war is Chapo is in jail. Chapo's got life plus 30 years. And to give you an idea of his money, the Americans brought a forfeiture order for $12 billion against him. The Sinaloa is still active. It's still selling drugs. The drugs carry on. And what we're not doing ever is following the money. We do not follow the money. We do not go to the money at the top and chase it and find out who it is who's making the money. How is it? I mean, without HSBC, Chapo would not have been able to buy his aircraft, his submarines, his guns. He wouldn't have been able to pay his sicarios, which is what they call the killers. He wouldn't have been able to pay for it's a daft thing to say, sounds daft. He wouldn't have been able to educate his children. You can't pay school fees in holdalls of cash. And, he was able to do all these things because he had dollar accounts. If we cut that off early on, he wouldn't have been anywhere near as successful.
Yeah. There's a few points we want to get through. I'm itching to get to a point that Andy Candy made in the chat about about HSBC. Before I get to that, though, just very, very briefly, Chris, the most troubling piece in the book is the text that you received. I'll read it out, make sure I get this right word for word. If I've understood the book correctly, you received a text from somebody quite senior. It was a response to the question you were putting to this person about, why is it that the little people end up getting stuff? Those are my words, not yours. And his or her response was, in the clash of the titans, the small fry get crushed. Yeah. In the clash of the titans, the small fry get crushed. Are you happy to say who sent you that text? And what do you think about what
I deliberately don't. I can it's still on my phone.
You're getting drummed out of the brownies, don't do that.
Okay.
It's still
okay. But it is rather revealing, though, isn't it? It is rather revealing that somebody says in the clash of the titans, the small fry get crushed.
Andy, you're absolutely right. When it landed, I had to do a double, triple, quadruple take. This was a person who played a major role in the story, and I was trying to persuade him that out of a sense of public duty,
Ah,
he could actually explain his role. And we went backwards and forwards. He said no. I'm the sort of person, I'm afraid, I don't take no for an answer. So I kept coming back at him, saying, come on, you owe it to people. And yes, it's on here still. There is a text message from him saying, in the clash of the Titans, the little people get crushed, which was his way of saying, you know, live with it. You're a little person. I'm not going to help you. You know, and who are the Titans? The Titans are the bank, the government, the banks, and the government. And that's how. And there's a reference to this in the book as well, which is throughout my years covering banks and at HS, the Evening Standard and elsewhere, I became aware that the very senior bankers, they do not care about what happens in this country. Or to the little people. I quote two people in the book. I don't name them, but one was a guy at Merrill Lynch who I said to him, it was on the eve of a general election in Britain. And I said to him, are you excited about tomorrow? And he looked at me and said, Chris, we're more excited about Indonesia's privatization program than we are about what happens in this country. Remarkably, or not remarkably, the same thing happened with a very, 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 very senior guy from Goldman Sachs in London who came to lunch at the Evening Standard literally just before the Scottish referendum decision, for the vote. And we were talking about it and about the whole country being on tenterhooks. And he actually put his hand up and said, I need to tell you something. And we said, what? He said, at Goldman Sachs, we don't care. We don't care about the union. It means nothing to us. And that is a prevailing attitude. These banks do not, their bosses fly the world in their jets. They've got nowhere they call home. They, you know, stop them in the street and say, where do you pay tax? They'd probably struggle with an answer. You know, that's their attitude, and that needs changing as well.
Thank you so much. We're going to open things up to questions and comments. We do have a hard stop at 1:30, guys, so we're going to have to be as succinct as we can. It's been such a remarkably interesting conversation already. I'm sure everybody would agree. Before we go any further, could I please invite everybody to show their appreciation to, obviously, to Chris for writing the book and talking about it, but also for Brian Basham for being a sparring partner today. It's been really, really good, guys. Thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you very much.
It's on Amazon. Buy it.
we've put a link in the chat, Chris.
Man's a huckster, Chris. Don't have anything to do with the man. He's man's a huckster. I just want to say one little thing here, because there's a very interesting thing here, and I will take it very quickly. Chris asks why. Well, I was involved in political fundraising for a long time, and one of the reasons why that there isn't a prosecution of fraud is because they don't want to nick their donors. That's one of the reasons. It's as simple as that.
Absolutely right.
And Jared Bibler has written a chat, which I commend to you, as echoing that really. Following the money will bring down politicians, and there's no incentive for that. And he also says, has anyone watched The Wire? I highly recommend it. I mean, I could also recommend a program that I've been watching on television somewhere, I don't know, my wife knows where it is, Ozark, which is all about money laundering.
Yeah.
Money is no good. The banks are an integral part of organized crime. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you. We're going to go to Andy Candy. I just want to sort of bit of a preface for Andy Candy's comment that I'm hoping he's going to be happy to make. HSBC's deferred prosecution agreement had a profound knock-on consequence, we within the TTF think, Chris, which is that it meant that because HSBC was in so much trouble already and it had to keep a clean rap sheet thereafter, it basically meant that HSBC was going to be very, very difficult for any UK authority to prosecute, because if it did, it would blow up the whole money laundering thing yet over again. Andy Candy, if you're happy to, come on camera and share your thoughts about that particular matter. We haven't got much time, Andy, so I'm going to have to ask you to be as succinct as possible if you're happy to speak to that particular point. And if you want, just explain briefly how you got involved in all this in the first place, Andy. Thank you.
Yeah, I was basically sold an interest rate swap, missold an interest rate swap in 2008 by HSBC, and trying to progress any inquiry about that from 2009 onwards, when I discovered it, was met with an absolute stonewalling. However, at the time, I think around 2011, I'd approached the FSA and was asking about all their handbook rules, going through it, and they informed me at that time that they were undergoing an investigation into the part of the bank I was complaining about. And yet no follow-up was ever done about it, but it was global markets. It was to do with FX transactions, interest rate swaps, derivatives, hedging, and yet we're still now 13 years on fighting the consequences of that. You go after HSBC, you hit an absolute stone wall on every occasion. And I mean, even today, I sort of found an order from the FCA in 2014 where the HSBC were fined over 200 million for FX breaches. I mean, huge. I mean, it would have been 309 plus, but they got a 30% discount. I mean, ridiculous. And you just see this effect, but it sort of states in the notices on that, they're quite incredible, that they weren't, you know, in any of the notices to do with LIBOR or Euribor rigging, but yet then carried out operations internally to address the same things that have been identified at other banks. So you've got to look at things like that, where all the other banks are being pursued for LIBOR rigging. And again, of course, you've got Andy Verity's lowballing tapes, which has come out. So I hope there's going to be a further exposition on that. But obviously, there are key cases with UK traders pending appeal. But it just shows a massive cover up on HSBC. Just don't get targeted for anything.
HSBC, if I can just interject there.
Thanks, Andy.
It's a very good story. HSBC does hold a special position for our government. It is by far our biggest bank. It's the biggest bank in Europe, and because of that, it has this status. And one thing I also learned, I mean, in that roll call of my own career, I spent 5 years inside the Houses of Parliament as Westminster correspondent, and I quickly realised that politicians from any side, whether they're Tory or Labour or Lib Dem, they are totally in the thrall of people with money. They go literally starry-eyed. It's really bizarre. And even the Tories. And here you've got this massive bank, and the thing that Osborne was saying was that if we prosecute these bankers, you bring down HSBC. Well, that is so ridiculous. The idea you can't prosecute 3 or 4 individuals in a bank the size of HSBC, which at that time was employing 330,000 people.
Wow.
And the whole bank collapses. Not just that, he said the whole of Western finance would collapse.
Yeah.
And that gave you, he offered no evidence for this, by the way. No evidence was ever offered. They didn't even offer any research as to, had anyone researched whether it was possible. It just shows how starry-eyed they were when confronted with the bank like that.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you very much, Andy, for sharing what you've explained. We'll keep digging around those issues, as you know. Mr. Philip Meadowcroft, please keep it as succinct as you can. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. If I can provide some up-to-date news in respect of the FCA decision announced on the Friday before bank holiday about the HBOS investigation that they were pressed into by the Treasury Select Committee 4.5 years ago. I had a reply yesterday from Mark Stewart, who is the Director of Enforcement of the FCA, because I had asked why had the investigation stopped, because no reasons were given by the FCA in their announcement. And I read you so that there's been no possible misunderstanding. He writes, "Thank you for your email. The press announcement on August 26 is not a detailed document about the HBOS investigation. Well, that's interesting to start with. In accordance with FCA policy, the FCA announced that it had taken no action in relation to HBOS because the FCA had previously made public that it was conducting an enforcement investigation. The decision to announce that the FCA and PRA had opened investigation into the HBOS matter followed the public recommendations and report by Andrew Green QC that the FCA and PRA should consider whether any former HBOS senior managers should be the subject of enforcement and investigation. He then gives me links to the announcements at that time. Consequently, upon conclusion of the investigations, we issued a press statement to inform the public of the outcome. In other words, the press announcement to say, we are no longer investigating. It doesn't say anything about lack of prosecutions. And this morning, I have tackled Stuart specifically to state, are they going to prosecute or not? What he has said, I think, is worthy of a script for Yes Minister, and for to be people like Sir Humphrey to articulate such absurdities that the press announcement is not a detailed document about the HBOS investigation. We did it because we announced that there was an investigation. Now we're telling you there is no investigation. What rubbish.
Yeah.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you very, very much. We're going to be running out of time shortly. We've covered so much ground so quickly. Time has really flown. Stephen Barker, I know you've read the book and you really rated it very highly. I'm putting you on the spot here just to give Nigel a chance to find his mute button. Stephen, your brief comments about the book, please. Thanks, Stephen.
Right. Yes, absolutely. Got my copy here.
Right.
Chris, if you can see it, thank you. Worth every penny, I have to say.
That's one, Chris.
Just as an indicator, I don't think I've read a book on this subject where I've had to turn down so many corners of the pages because it's a new point and a detailed point. That's good journalism and good report writing. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
What I would say, and your book makes it absolutely clear, and I know you don't set yourself up as an expert in banking. You're a journalist. You're quite deprecating about that fact. But you've managed to discover and put in hard numbers in your book. I don't know where you get the sources, but here's an example. 312 customers accounted for approximately 32% of the total physical US dollars from 2006 to 2008. And HSBC Mexico exported over 1.1 billion US dollars from Sinaloa to HSBC in the US. That's just demonstrating the flow of cash into the financial system.
What they did, if I can just help you there. This is
So that's page 233, if I may say, Christopher, if you want to refresh your memory.
Yeah,
Well,
what they did was that they all these dollars were coming into Mexico, into the HSBC Mexico, and they hired. I mean, the idea HSBC didn't know what was going on is laughable, because they hired armored cars. Really, you know, those giant armored cars, those giant black things that they have in the States. They hired those with outriders and security, and every so often they would drive over the border from, I'm going to get my geography right, a place called, and my apologies for the pronunciation, I think it's called Jimenez on the Mexican side, over the Rio Grande River to El Paso, where they would, the armored car would stop at the HSBC US, and of course all these dollars would go back into this American system. And the Americans, the DEA and CIA, saw this happening, and the volumes were colossal. Of course, you don't hire an armored car on a regular basis with outriders, with security, you know, to take billions of dollars across the Rio Grande if you don't know where they're from.
Exactly. And that money is going into the international system, and that money ends up in the UK and other countries.
Well, there's one point we've not touched upon. I know it's we're stopping, but right at the end, there was a very good, actually, an American lawyer who was so appalled by what he saw in the Department of Justice when they didn't prosecute. When he then went into private practice, he brought a case against HSBC on behalf of 6 victims, American victims of Chapo. So their loved ones had been killed horribly. He decided to sue on the basis that laundered money led to their deaths. Now, he won. He lost on appeal, and they said, "We hear what you say, but you can't prove that the bullets used and the guns used to kill your relatives actually came from this money that went into HSBC." At least he tried. HSBC, of course, through every lawyer in New York was employed to be on this case. It got very little, hardly any publicity. They made sure of that. But there is a serious point here, and it comes back to follow the money.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Cheers, gents. Let's just jump to Nigel Cairns quickly.
Yes, I'd like to ask Chris a question about HSBC, which is to what extent, if at all, he thinks that the behaviour or ethos of HSBC Bank can be explained by its origins in Hong Kong, and perhaps something to do with its history of.
Yeah, there's a certain irony for people who don't know. HSBC actually started as funding the opium trade between Hong Kong and China and India, and actually the British government, there is a great coincidence here, the British government went into bat for the opium trade, which led to the opium wars with China. I think that's true to an extent. What happened after that is that HSBC, and I mentioned this earlier, became this fiercely idiosyncratic bank that was run on almost imperialistic lines, where they didn't call them managers, they were called officers. So you were called an international officer. You didn't have a holiday, you had leave of service, exactly the same as the British Army. Until 1982, if you were a single man, an international officer working for HSBC, in theory, you had to seek the chairman's permission to get married. They talked about being stationed in countries. Now, very quickly, on the one hand, that made them very odd, and the city used to mock them and call them honkers and shankers. But it also possibly, and this might be what you're getting at, also led to a sort of imperialistic arrogance that they thought they were above things. They were doing things the proper way. In fact, they weren't. I mean, and to bring it to Mexico, one of the things that really upset the Mexican authorities, who are very much on the side of good, of course, some of them are corrupt, but the ones I spoke to were appalled by what happened. And one thing that really annoyed them was that there's a scene in the book, I think, where a guy's invited to dinner at the new Mexican manager's apartment, and the guy is showing him this apartment, and the Mexican bank supervisor is thinking, yeah, I was only here a few months ago with someone else. This is a serviced apartment. They never put down roots. They never bought houses there, properties. They never learnt the language, and that really offended the Mexicans. They were deeply offended by that the senior HSBC bankers, the country managers, never bothered to learn Spanish. And they came in for 1 or 2 years. It was a stepping stone to somewhere else, and off they'd go. And this being treated like that, which of course is very much how the British Empire was run, well, frankly, it cheeses people off.
Yeah. The additional point I wanted to also make, Chris, was that HSBC, I think I'm right in saying, purchased Midland so that it could get a banking license in the UK. But has the real power base ever truly shifted to London from Hong Kong,
well,
especially at the moment?
It has, in the sense that the top brass are in London, although when I met Stephen
the
Green,
profits are coming from Hong Kong.
yeah,
still,
when I
aren't
met Stephen Green, I talk about his office in the book and how he got this spectacular office at the top of the tower in Canary Wharf. And I said to him, what an amazing view. And he actually said to me, and this isn't in the book, he actually said to me, and it is an amazing view. You've got the whole Thames and the city, you know, it's a fantastic view. Probably the best view in London. And he said to me, it's not as good as the view from Hong Kong Harbour.
Yeah.
And I was really taken by him saying that. And I said, would you rather be in Hong Kong Harbour? And he said, we're here. But he made it sound very much like home for them is still Hong Kong. It's not Britain.
Gentlemen, we have to come in there. Sorry, we've gone over. We have a hard stop right now, so we have to cut it in there. This could have gone on for a lot longer. Can we please once again thank Chris and Brian and everybody else for participating so fully today?
Look, thank you.
It's a great book. Thank you very much indeed, guys. Well, I do hope you found that video useful and informative in some way. Please do remember, if you haven't already done so, become either a subscription member or make a donation. Both of the links you need are coming up on your screen now. And they're also in the video description. Thanks again. Thank you.